Hello and welcome to this session on Zero Trust and why now is the time for Zero Trust, now more than ever before actually. My name is Michael Gustafsson. I work as a lead domain specialist here at CITRIX, where I cover security and workspace intelligence mostly. All right, this is the agenda for this session. We are going to talk about kind of the overall challenge here. Why does this session even matter, right? And we're going to talk about kind of how 2020 actually affected everyone pretty much, and the consequences of that around IT security. We're also going to talk about Zero Trust in general and give you guys a brief introduction to Zero Trust. This might be repetitive to many of you, but it's still important to set what I'm talking about in the correct context. We're then going to transition that into more of the modern Zero Trust frameworks that exists out there and try to make this a bit more tangible, right? So how does our product relate to Zero Trust and what can you actually achieve with our products? Which of course is also going to transition into what CITRIX can do to help your organization achieve that Zero Trust framework or that Zero Trust security posture. All right, let's jump straight into it. Why does this matter and why should you even care, right? So as you all know, I mean, IT security in general is a bit of a cat and mouse game, right? So systems and products becomes a bit more secure, and just as that happens, new vulnerabilities and attacks are actually found, right? And this has been kind of the back and forth over the longest time. And now, if we actually look at some numbers around IT security in general, these are probably old and outdated by now, but some figure I found, according to Gartner, companies spend more than $114 billion a year on security, right? So that's quite a lot of money. And yet, I mean, 66% of those companies are still breached every year. So doesn't really pay out, right? And I mean, even worse, many of those companies are actually breached multiple times a year, right? So it's quite clear that today's security is not actually that secure, right? So if we think about 2020 as well and what that meant for any kind of digital work, essentially, it's even worse, right? And we're going to discuss that a bit later on. If we, though, zoom out a bit first and think about kind of the current landscape in IT and how organizations are using IT today, we can, of course, see that most of companies are using cloud in some shape, way, or form, right? Companies has most often implemented some sort of DevOps methodology and use modern development methodologies and are still in very much hybrid environments, right? So, I mean, all cloud nor no cloud is still not going to be that one golden bullet, right? And it's probably not going to be in the future either. You're always going to have to tailor your environment to your needs, which is probably not going to be either or. Now, I've tried to find some numbers on what seem to be the kind of most common causes of the breaches that has been occurring in the past. And it seems that though even we have all of these modern environments, we have different automated security and such, some sort of credential misuse or credential theft are still kind of the leading cause of breaches, right? So you might ask yourself, why does this matter, right? Could there be some other potential issues lower down in the stack that's causing this, right? Could it be that some sort of traditional perimeter-based security posture is actually causing this, right? So let's get into that a bit more. And at CITRIX, we recently commissioned a pulse survey amongst IT security leaders because we wanted to try to figure out some more data behind that exact fact, right? We wanted to kind of understand the current state of Zero Trust because, I mean, the concept of Zero Trust has been around for over a decade. So what's going on and why is stuff going on? And since 2020 has forced a massive shift for companies to support remote workforces, right? One of the very big questions we wanted to get a better understanding on is, of course, VPNs, right? So according to our survey, you can clearly tell that many customers just essentially scaled out their VPNs to support remote work. And before this massive work shift, we had somewhere around 1 to 10% of workers accessing their enterprises remotely. And today, as you all know, of course, this number has increased significantly, right? And 72% of those are still utilizing VPNs for remote work. Now, the question is, why does all this matter in a session around zero trust and security, right? We are, of course, going to cover that in more detail, but if we talk about zero trust in general for a couple of minutes, it essentially means that we start with the default deny and we remove implicit trust. So just because you've tried to access something once and been given trust to do so, you should not have implicit trust to do whatever you want later on, right? And if we kind of zoom out and think about how a VPN works, right? Once you've authenticated, you've connected, you essentially have full implicit trust to an entire network, right? So you probably see some of the issues that are looming here. But on a more positive note around this, we also found that many organizations have seen this, right? This is not going to be a long-term viable solution to fix remote work, of course. And 2020 really pushed many organizations to get moving with their kind of remote work strategies. And over 60% is currently actively looking to alter their strategy right now as we speak. So that's, of course, a good thing. And if we look at how they intend to do it, we can see that short to midterm, many customers are actually moving towards some sort of zero trust security posture, right? And this survey is actually very interesting read. So I'd highly suggest that you visit the link below and read up on it more. It covers a bunch more details and not just about VPNs. It's kind of an overview of the current security scenario. And now, before we look at how CITRIX actually fits into all of this in a more tangible way, let's briefly explain zero trust a bit more, because you've seen the numbers now, you've gained the insight that today's security might not be as secure as you could hope for, and that some action is actually needed. Now, if we start with zero trust, what is zero trust then? Let's actually start with what zero trust is not. And many of you have probably heard all of this before, but just in case, let me reiterate, right? Zero trust is not a product or a solution. Zero trust is a concept that trust between different people and access must be constantly earned while continuously encrypted, audited, and monitored, right? In its essence. This means that zero trust is not a product, it's not a SKU, it's not any vendor's one exclusive thing, right? And neither is it especially easy, right? Because zero trust is concepts and frameworks, right? That you have to implement across many different parts of your organization and across many different products and vendors. So, I mean, zero trust applies to pretty much any related product, right? It could be in the case of your IDPs, your DLPs, your SWIGs, UEMs. I mean, it really doesn't matter. It spans the entire portfolio of products that you as a customer might use. But now that you know what zero trust is not, let's have a look at what it actually is, right? So zero trust was actually popularized by Forrester nearly a decade ago, and it was actually invented to challenge that existing perimeter-based security strategy, right? And in its infancy, it was mostly about network access, right? We start with a default deny and you then have to earn trust, right? But that, of course, it's not really that relevant today only in itself, because Zero Trust has grown in its scope and its definition, right? So it's evolved beyond the networks. We address new threats and compliances and so on, right? So Zero Trust has grown quite a lot and now consists of different methodologies, different frameworks that you can kind of pick and choose from to architect the best solution for your environment, of course. There is, however, a few key principles that's quite important to know of. So, of course, when it comes to Zero Trust, one of the big changes is that we remove the perimeter, right? And that's because we're supposed to actually view the networks, all networks, to be hostile, right? There is no safe zone inside and unsecure zone outside, right? All networks is actually hostile, and we assume breach. External and internal threats exist on the network and at all times, pretty much. Network locality is not sufficient in deciding trust in a network, right? So we need more factors to base that off. Every device, user, and network flow is, of course, authenticated and authorized, so no anonymous access to things left and right. And we try to apply least privilege and strictly enforce access controls, of course. Now, as I mentioned, since Zero Trust has evolved, right, policies, of course, has to be dynamic and calculated from as many sources of data as possible, right? And that's because the threats and the different mitigations that you're trying to apply is, of course, going to change over time. And again, we need to authenticate everything, encrypt everything, users, devices, and apps, and encrypt data in transit and as well as rest. So that's kind of the core principles that you would need to follow, which means that any type of implicit trust must therefore be removed entirely from the equation, right? And let's try to visualize this a bit more. You all remember probably the golden era of the network perimeter, right? We had a fort, if you will, with a moat around it, and you had all your users, all your apps, all your data inside that fort, right? There was no need to go outside of the fort, and we had no need to actually let new people into the fort or data or devices, right? So everything was actually quite secure. The walls worked, the perimeters worked, and all the threats remained outside, right? Now, applications has moved outside in recent years, right? There has been quite a paradigm shift over the past 10, 15 years in IT, right? If we think about it. I mean, we're all using infrastructure as a service to a larger extent. We are using SaaS apps to a much larger extent. We're using hybrid environments. Now, applying the perimeter-based security posture around this kind of environment, of course, is going to give you some challenges, right? Because there's going to be inconsistent visibility and security and controls around that. Because, I mean, I do not own the data center that Salesforce runs within. So how am I going to secure Salesforce or Office 365 or whatever the case might be, right? And this might also lead to quite a confusing end user experience quite often, right? And I mean, also, if we look at users has actually moved outside nowadays, right? So the digital ecosystem has grown. People are using mobile. And if we think about 2020, this is certainly true. We had to support remote workers to a much larger extent than ever before. So this has kind of changed as to how this was done in the past, right? And when it comes to the actual threats as well, threats has actually moved inside. We have malicious actors. We have phishing attempts that are way more complex than ever before. So people are actually falling for them and credentials are stolen. And we have a lot of single factor authentication, which simply isn't good enough, right? So the entire landscape has changed and you kind of have to address this in a new manner. We can no longer actually use that perimeter-based type security model because everything has changed, of course. Now, before we move on to the more tangible parts of Zero Trust and CITRIX, I would just like to throw up a quote. This is quite a good quote I found. It's an excerpt from Forrester's Future-Proof Your Digital Business. And it essentially says that the data economy and recent paradigm shifts in IT technology renders today's perimeter-based security useless, right? As businesses try to monetize information and insights across complex systems, business ecosystems, and fragment data and services across clouds and different locations, the idea of corporate perimeter becomes quaint, right? Even dangerous. This is spot on, according to me, right? So you kind of have to be, you kind of have to adapt nowadays. Now, this all sounds a bit scary, right? We all have to do something about this if you still are using that kind of perimeter-based security posture. But how do you actually go about this? What does this actually mean in terms of products and features that you need, right? So let's discuss this a bit more and talk about the modern zero-trust frameworks and how those actually applies to the CITRIX portfolio. Now, one very important piece to think about when you're trying to address this zero-trust security posture within your organization, and this is an add-on and a framework provided by Gartner. It's called the Continuous Adaptive Risk and Trust Assessment. And this requires you to have an ongoing loop where you try to predict what's going to happen. So we prioritize risk, we anticipate threats, and so on, right? And we then try to prevent things as a next step, right? So we harden our systems, we isolate systems and do different prevention measures, right? And then we, of course, need to detect when something's going on, right? So detect those incidents, confirm them, prioritize the risks, and also, of course, contain the incidents, which then translates into the actual response phase, right? We need to remediate those, implement design changes, policy changes, and so on. So not only having a default deny, but you also need to have this ongoing loop across systems, users, data, architecture, networks, and so on, and have this ongoing loop that continues on and on and on forever, where you kind of adapt and have this effect on your environment where it changes to the current needs when it comes to security, right? So this is one very major and important part that you need to think of. And from a workspace perspective, this is also where CITRIX and CITRIX Analytics comes into the picture. I am going to cover that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. But if you ask the folks at Forrester Research, they'll probably tell you that most organizations still have a long way to go on the road to actually implementing zero-trust security. And I think partially because, I mean, it's very hard to kind of have those concrete technology purchases that you need, right? Because as I mentioned, it's more of a framework, a methodology, a concept that you have to do. It's not a product. I can't buy this product and now I have zero trust, right? So it's kind of hard. And this is also why Forrester introduced the Zero Trust Extended Framework, right? So to help enterprises actually perform strategic decisions and map technology purchases to the implementation of a zero trust ecosystem, right? So let's briefly examine the kind of key pillars in the CTX framework and outline kind of how those map into the CITRIX products, right? So according to the CTX framework, we essentially have these 6 key pillars. We have the data, of course, so we need to understand how to enable data categorization, schemas, isolation, encryption, and control. And of course, networks. This is quite standard to zero trust networking and what it has been since the start. But of course, we need to figure out how we can actually enable network isolation, segmentation, and network security, of course. And when it comes to the people, what does the solution do to actually secure the people using the network and kind of business infrastructure that we have? Does it reduce threats that the users can create on their own, right? And around workload, does it actually secure cloud networks, the different apps, right? Does it secure Salesforce? to the policies that you want to have implemented and so on, right? And the same goes for devices, right? Does it isolate, secure, and control the devices? Can you actually visualize breaches on devices? Can you actually find out that they are going on? And visibility and analytics. This is one of the key pieces, of course. What data points do we have to actually ongoingly be able to do that continuous loop and have insight of what's going on in our environments? If we zoom in a bit more and talk about the kind of capabilities that you need for each of those key pillars, if we look at data to begin with, we of course need visibility of data on all channels and repositories, right? So SaaS apps, infrastructure as a service, networks, data centers, endpoints, mobile, right? We need visibility of that data, of course, in order to be able to protect it. But also remember that I previously mentioned that we need to encrypt everything. So of course, we need to be able to control encryption, classification, and communication with different control points, right? So endpoints, emails, clouds, webs, all of those parts, right? We need to have control of that data. And of course, visibility by kind of building a perimeter around the data with identity and kind of user behavior. So involving machine learning into all of that to understand what's going on with the data. Is someone trying to exfiltrate data from your organization? If we move on to the network, of course, this is, as I previously mentioned, quite basic and quite static to how it was in the past, how the initial iterations of Zero Trust was in the past, rather. We need to provide some sort of least privileged granular access control, right? So using software-defined perimeters, we need to be able to segment networks and so on, right? In order to make sure that the network follows those Zero Trust principles. And now, when it comes to the actual workloads, we of course need to have some sort of centralized policies for security, visibility, and compliance across the different platforms, right? And this is quite a hard nut to crack nowadays. How are you going to be able to set kind of a default policy around security that you and your organization requires, and then apply that across all of those different SaaS apps, file repositories, infrastructure as a services, and so on, right? But we also need to control access to and communication between sensitive apps and workloads and containers, of course, right? And enforce malware protection on those workloads as well. So that's quite a key piece in here. And now when it comes to the devices, of course, we need to protect the devices against advanced threats. We need to kind of safeguard all of the users. The user shouldn't have to be an IT pro to be safe, right? Everybody should be able to use any device that your corporation has issued and still be safe, right? So we need to be able to verify the device integrity and securely connect that device to some application or data or whatever the need is, right? And then we need to apply controls to kind of monitor behavior and have an ongoing device health check, right? Because just because a device is initially healthy and deemed safe, it doesn't mean that's the way it's going to remain forever, of course. And now, when it comes to people, we of course have to provide application-specific access, right? And this is a big one: multi-factor authentication, right? We can't have that single factor and allow access. It just does not hold up today. And of course, context-aware access, right? We need to consider posture changes as the user connects. And this is actually also one of the key parts when we are talking Zero Trust in general, right? So what's the context of the user trying to connect? Did he travel from New York to, say, India in 30 minutes? I mean, that is not physically possible. So we need to somehow understand the context of what's going on with the people, and then adapt the environment, adapt the connections, and have that dynamic adaptability of the environment, right? So this is also one of those key pieces, of course. And then we need to have some sort of analytics on top of all this, right? So we need to have some sort of user behavior analytics across data and threat protection products. we of course need to correlate that information across all of the different products that we have. So if you have a clue to something going on in one product, you should easily be able to correlate the rest of the evidence that you might have, that you might want to check for some specific action that has happened, right? So the analytics piece is a key component in here as well. And now, if we drill this down into a bit more specific features that you would need, right? When it comes to data, you need some sort of DLP, right? That's a key point. You need some sort of data loss prevention. Of course, I did mention before, you need encryption, tagging, and analytics of your data. You need device encryption, right? So surrounding data, that's kind of the key points that you are going to have to look for in the product that you're going to use in order to fulfill your zero trust security posture when it comes to data. And when it comes to the workloads, of course, we need some sort of cloud workload protection, right? We need to protect the storage that the data resides on as well. And we might need to use CASBs and compliance automation, and also reverse proxies or WAFs, depending on the workload that you're actually providing, right? Around networking, of course, I did talk about this quite extensively, but you need some sort of software-defined perimeter, cloud proxying, SD-WANing, and firewalling, and of course, encrypt traffic, encrypt management of the networks, and so on, right? On devices, device protection and management, of course. If you're into IoT and you're running IoT, this is also quite a big part. Of course, you need some sort of IoT security surrounding your IoT. And of course, in general, data center security, right? And workforce and the people, we have to make sure that we use multi-factor authentication. We prompt for authentication whenever the users are trying to access something. We need some sort of web and email gateways. And also, to safeguard the users, we need some sort of browser isolation, right? So a disposable browser, if you will, right? The user is not sure if he can click a link. Why not? If he can click a link, why not just use that disposable browser when you have to reach something that might be unsafe or when you're unsure, right? And do that content analysis and sandboxing. And of course, automation analytics, kind of the key point in all of this. We need some sort of data-driven analytics and reporting, preferably do full packet capturing and do forensics on that. Endpoint, network, cloud, email reporting, and threat analysis, analytics as well, of course. And now the big question kind of becomes, all right, so if these are some of the key pieces that I need in order to integrate this in my environment, what's the product I could use, right? So not surprising, we at CITRIX try to cater to this entire flora, right? Because you probably realize that you could achieve this with whatever products you want. But what's the downsides of having 10 different products spread across devices, data, workloads, networks, and so on? Well, it's going to be quite hard to manage that, right? And when it comes to support cases, imagine support cases in between all of those, right? And this is where we try to provide you that single pane of glass, right? So it's not only just the workforce and using Workspace to access your environment. We want to provide that full insight across the entire suite. So when it comes to data, we of course offer ShareFile, which has many of those functionalities that you need. And when it comes to workload, we of course have CITRIX Cloud and our secure internet access. On the network side of things, we of course have SD-WAN. On devices, we of course provide unified endpoint management, allowing you to actually control all of those devices across the different operating systems that you might need. And when it comes to the workforce, the people, we of course provide Workspace, right? So Workspace is this kind of unified access point for all of the employees, right? All of the users can access everything they need through Workspace. And since Workspace is this one single aggregation point, it's actually quite easy for IT admins to apply a uniform set of security policies over all of the different types of apps, right? It's not just CITRIX apps. It might be SaaS apps, on-premises web apps. It really doesn't matter, because with Workspace and access control, you're actually going to be able to provide that uniform security around all of the different apps and desktops and data. And also, when it comes to analytics, of course, we have the CITRIX Analytics service, which can provide that continuous insight and give you access to that entire loop that you need in order to actually understand what's going on in your environment. So that was essentially it for this session. Hopefully you gained some insight as to what specifically you need to address when it comes to zero trust security models. And how CITRIX can actually help you, what products we have, and how those apply, right? Don't hesitate to ask questions or reach out if you need more information. Thank you, everyone.